It's a really interesting time, isn't it, when you see maybe the biggest friction points aren't just between, traditional adversaries.
Hmm.
Right now, we're actually seeing this undercurrent of tension within the G7.
That group of big industrialized countries, U.S., Canada, Germany, France, Italy, Japan, U.K.
Exactly. And specifically, it seems to be bubbling up between the U.S. and the EU, particularly on how they're handling Russia and, of course, Ukraine.
Yeah, and what's so striking is that both sides, the U.S. and the EU, are obviously deeply involved here.
Hmm.
But their strategies, maybe even their basic ideas about how to get things done,
Hmm.
they seem to be pulling apart a bit.
Absolutely. So for this deep dive, that's what we want to unpack this transatlantic split. We've looked at analysis from international news, from think tanks, focusing on the economic moves, the diplomacy, the sort of bigger picture geopolitics. Our mission today, really, for you listening, is to get a handle on where the U.S. and EU disagree on Russia, try to understand why they disagree, and think about what these different paths could mean. For Ukraine, yes, but also for that whole Western alliance idea.
And we'll try to hit the key points without getting bogged down in, every single detail.
Exactly. Okay, so let's kick off with the European Union strategy. They've been pretty front and center, haven't they?
They really have. I mean, after Russia's full-scale invasion back in 2022, the EU put together what most people see as a very, very tough sanctions regime against Moscow.
Package after package.
Exactly, targeting really critical parts of the Russian economy.
And when we say critical, we mean the things that really power their economy and war machine, like banks, energy, defense, tech access, that kind of stuff.
Precisely. The idea was to seriously squeeze Russia's finances and stop them getting the resources they need for the military side of things.
Mm.
And the scale is, well, it's pretty big.
How big are we talking?
Well, by May 2025, the EU had sanctioned over 2,400 individuals and entities, people and companies linked to the Russian regime.
Wow. That's a lot. It shows they're casting a really wide net, and it feels like they're constantly looking for new ways to tighten it, right? Like this focus on Russia's shadow fleet. What's that all about?
Yeah, that's become a big focus. This shadow fleet is basically a bunch of older oil tankers. Often you can't quite tell who owns them. They sail under different flags.
Dodgy flags.
Kinda, yeah. Flags of convenience. And Russia's been using them to get around Western sanctions on its oil exports. They've been key for keeping trade going, especially with places like India and China.
Ah, okay.
So the EU's latest sanctions package, the 18th one, it included a ban on another 189 of these ships using EU ports. That brings the total number of banned tankers up to 342.
So they're actively trying to shut down those workarounds.
Directly trying to block those routes, yes. Closing loopholes.
And I've also heard talk about pushing to lower the price cap on Russian oil even further. What's the idea there?
Right, so the G7 set up this price cap, currently trying to limit Russia's oil money, but keep oil flowing globally. But the EU is pushing to cut that cap way down, maybe to $30 a barrel.
That's a big cut.
It is. The goal is just to starve Russia of even more oil revenue, making it harder and harder to fund the war.
It definitely paints a picture of the EU digging in for, sustained, maybe even escalating economic pressure. What are the main reasons behind this strong stance?
Well, there are a few things feeding into it. First, just geography, right? The EU is right there, close to the conflict. They feel that threat from Russian aggression much more directly.
Makes sense.
So there's a real drive to stop the fighting, prevent more instability. But beyond that, there's also this strong principle of, upholding international law, defending Ukraine's sovereignty.
Right, the foundational stuff. We even have that quote from Kaja Kallas, who's been a pretty strong voice.
Exactly. She really emphasizes keeping that pressure constant. The thinking in the EU seems to be that only relentless increasing pressure will make Russia stop. Sanctions are seen as absolutely vital for that.
And how does Ukraine itself see these EU efforts? Does Kyiv think it's enough?
Well, look, Ukraine is obviously grateful for the huge support from the EU, including the sanctions.
Yeah.
But they consistently ask for more.
Tougher measures.
Yeah, tougher. Like specifically targeting countries that are still buying lots of Russian oil. Think China, India, because those sales are a massive financial lifeline for Moscow.
Right, going after those third-party buyers, keeping the cash flowing. And then there's that whole thorny issue of Russia's frozen assets in Western banks.
Exactly. Ukraine is really pushing the EU to take the next step to actually seize those assets. We're talking about something like $210 billion of Russian central bank money frozen in EU banks.
Wow.
Ukraine's argument is use that money for reconstruction, help rebuild the country after the war.
Mm-hmm.
But It's really complicated legally and
Right.
politically. There's a big debate inside the EU about whether they can legally do that, sovereign immunity concerns, potential blowback.
Okay, so the EU picture is strong, ongoing, possibly escalating sanctions, and grappling with these bigger questions like asset seizure. Now,
Mhm.
let's switch gears to the U.S. under President Trump. How does that compare?
Well, it's quite a contrast. The previous administration, Biden's, was mostly aligned with the EU on sanctions hitting energy, finance, key people. But the perspective under President Trump seems to signal a real shift. Different priorities, maybe different tactics.
We're hearing talk about potentially easing those same sanctions, which would be a huge turnaround. What's the logic being put forward for that?
President Trump has said his main goal is to get the war in Ukraine finished quickly.
Right, speed seems key.
Yeah. And his thinking seems to be that maybe using sanctions could be a carrot,
Oh.
an incentive for Russia to negotiate, to make peace talks happen. It suggests he might be willing to trade less economic pressure for a faster end to the fighting.
Then there was that meeting with Putin recently and some social media stuff that pointed that way too.
That's right. After a reported, 2-hour meeting with Putin back in May 2025, President Trump posted on social media about being open to, quote, substantial trade with Russia once the Ukraine conflict is over.
Which is pretty much the opposite of what the EU is trying to do, economically isolating Moscow.
Exactly. It clearly signals an interest in rebuilding economic ties, which flies in the face of the EU's whole strategy right now.
So the focus under Trump seems to be speed, making a deal. Maybe even if Ukraine has to give things up.
That seems to be the implication, yes. Trump's public statements have really hammered on ending the war fast, and there have been hints that his administration might lean on Ukraine to accept, territorial losses as part of a deal.
Which must be deeply worrying for Ukraine and a lot of allies.
Understandably so.
Mm-hmm.
The fear is it rewards aggression, sets a bad precedent.
And haven't there already been actions like pausing military aid earlier this year that had a real impact?
Correct. Early 2025, reports surfaced about a temporary halt in U.S. military aid to Ukraine. Now, the exact reasons are debated, but some analysts link that pause to Russia stepping up its attacks on Ukraine's power grid around that time.
Wow.
It just shows how these policy shifts can have immediate, real-world consequences on the battlefield.
This must all be causing a lot of anxiety in the EU and among other G7 countries, too. They must worry the U.S. could, maybe accidentally, maybe not, just undermine everything they're trying to do collectively.
Oh, absolutely. That's the core fear in Brussels and other allied capitals. If the U.S., the world's biggest economy, starts softening its line on Russia, well, that could seriously weaken the whole international sanctions effort.
Yeah, it could unravel things.
It could embolden Moscow, maybe make other countries think twice about their own stance. Potential cracking that united front they've tried to maintain. It really makes allies question the predictability, the cohesion of the Western alliance right now.
Okay, so we've got these diverging paths on sanctions, but then, adding another layer of tension, President Trump's threats of big tariffs on EU goods. That feels like a separate fight, but connected somehow.
It is connected, and it definitely throws more fuel on the fire in the transatlantic relationship.
Yeah.
President Trump has talked about potentially slapping a huge 50% tariff on all goods coming in from the EU.
50% on everything.
That's the threat, yeah. And it's not totally out of the blue. It fits with his long-term America First trade policy, his whole you tariff us, we tariff you back idea.
Right. It sounds like those earlier tariffs on EU steel and aluminum. Remind us about those.
Yeah, back in March 2025, the U.S. put a 25% tariff on steel and aluminum imports from the EU. And the EU had already drawn up plans to hit back. They were talking about a 50% tax on American bourbon, things like that.
So that trade fight was already brewing. And now this threat of a much wider 50% tariff. And then, didn't Trump reportedly counter-threaten with a 200% tariff on EU wine and spirits?
He did. It almost feels like, political theater, but with potentially massive economic damage for both sides.
Absolutely real consequences.
Definitely. And while the immediate hit is economic, a lot of analysts see a political game here, too.
How so?
The suggestion is that maybe these tariff threats are partly leverage, a way to pressure the EU on its Russia sanctions policy.
Okay. Like squeeze the EU economically to get them to soften their stance on Russia, to align more with Trump's goal of a quick end to the war.
That could be the underlying calculation, yes. Use economic pain to push for political alignment.
That's pretty aggressive, using that kind of tactic against longtime allies. How are European leaders reacting?
With a lot of alarm, frankly, and disappointment. Canada's foreign minister, Melanie Joly, Canada's obviously not EU, but a close ally. She called it potentially a trade war against allies.
Strong words.
Very. And Kaja Kallas, who we mentioned earlier, she's publicly expressed dismay about the strain on the U.S.-EU alliance. It's not the usual diplomatic language you expect between close G7 partners.
This really sounds like it's starting to weaken that traditional G7 unity. That group has always been key for coordinating Western responses, haven't it?
Absolutely. The
Yeah.
G7 U.S., Canada, Japan, Germany, France, Italy, UK, historically, they've aimed for a united front on big global issues, sanctions, crises, you name it. But President Trump's more, shall we say, unilateral approach is definitely challenging that old way of doing things, that consensus model.
There was the G7 foreign ministers meeting earlier in 2025 that sort of showed this. What happened there?
Right, the meeting in Limao, Canada, in March 2025, it became pretty clear the priorities were diverging. Reports suggest the U.S. wanted to focus discussions more on China, whereas many European members really wanted to push for tougher Russia sanctions.
Different agendas.
Exactly. And the end result was a final statement from the meeting that felt, well, weaker than usual. It didn't have that strong, unified message on Russia that you might have expected in the past. It signaled a bit of a crack in that united stance.
And the EU must be worried about a kind of domino effect, right? If the US backs off, who else might follow?
That's a huge concern. The fear is that if the U.S., this major player, starts easing sanctions or goes its own way, it could give cover to others who might be wavering. Hungary, under Viktor Orban, often comes up here.
Because Hungary has often pushed back against EU sanctions on Russia before.
Precisely. They've blocked or delayed things in the past,
Huh?
and there's a really critical deadline coming up in July 2025.
What's happening then?
The EU has to decide whether to renew the restrictions on those frozen Russian assets we talked about. Hungary could potentially veto that renewal.
Which would be a massive blow to the EU's strategy.
A huge setback, yeah. Both for keeping pressure on Russia and for potentially using that money to help Ukraine rebuild.
And it sounds like the EU is already thinking about backup plans, ways to maybe get around a potential Hungarian veto.
There are reports, yes, about the EU exploring what they're calling Hungary-proof measures, things like maybe capital controls or tariffs that wouldn't need every single member state to agree. But whether that's legally or practically possible, that's still a big question mark.
Okay, amidst all this high-level diplomacy and economic maneuvering, we have to remember Ukraine, the country actually facing the invasion. How are they seeing these splits emerge between their main supporters?
It puts Ukraine in an incredibly tough spot. I mean, they're dealing with the horrific daily reality of the war, the human cost, the economic devastation, Russia deliberately hitting their power grid.
This is trying to survive.
Exactly. And on top of that, they're watching these apparent cracks appear in the unity of their key Western partners. It must be deeply unsettling.
And it seems some U.S. policy moves under Trump have already hit Ukraine directly, not just affected Russia.
Tragically, yes. That reported 10% tariff the Trump administration put on Ukrainian exports to the U.S., while apparently not putting new ones on Russia. That caused real anger and dismay in Ukraine.
I can imagine.
Yuri Boyechko, from an organization called Hope for Ukraine, he basically said these tariffs will just make things worse economically, push more Ukrainians into poverty. It feels like a real kick when they're down, relying on international help.
It really highlights the contradictions and complexities here. And meanwhile, Ukraine keeps pleading for stronger, more unified action from the EU.
Absolutely. Their message is consistent, tougher sanctions, especially on countries buying Russian oil, because that's funding the war. And find a way, please, to use those frozen Russian assets to help rebuild our country. They're really looking to the EU to hold the line, maybe even step up, especially with the uncertainty around U.S. policy.
So, stepping back for the bigger picture. What's the wider context here? President Trump's America First philosophy seems like a big part of it.
It's definitely central, yeah. That America First idea means prioritizing what the administration sees as direct U.S. economic and strategic interests. Sometimes that means traditional alliances or broader stability take a back seat.
Like reports about U.S. interest in Ukraine's minerals or Arctic resources, those economic goals might be shaping the strategy.
That's a potential factor, yes. Those kinds of business interests could be playing into the strategic calculations about the conflict.
And it's not just the EU feeling this trade pressure from the U.S., is it?
No, reports suggest Canada, another close ally, G7 member, is facing similar tariff threats from the U.S. So it seems like a broader shift in how the U.S. is dealing with even its closest traditional partners on trade.
And on Russia, the idea of lifting sanctions in some areas like farming or fertilizers, that also seems to fit the America First trade focus.
It does seem to align, yes. Reports suggest Trump has considered lifting sanctions on Russian agriculture and fertilizers, arguing it could boost American trade. Again, it points to maybe prioritizing economic deals with Russia even while the war in Ukraine is still going on.
Of course, we should remember, sanctions aren't always a magic bullet, are they? Russia has found ways to adapt.
That's a crucial point. Russia has been pretty resourceful in adapting,
Mm.
selling more oil to India and China, for example. Those countries have become huge buyers.
Undermining the Western sanctions.
Exactly. It shows the limits of sanctions that aren't truly global. And it raises that really tricky question for the EU. Do they eventually have to consider hitting those big buyers, like India and China, with secondary sanctions? Which would be a massive, complex move with huge global economic fallout.
Okay, so let's try and sum this up. We're seeing a real split, a fundamental disagreement between key Western allies on how to handle Russia and Ukraine.
Yeah.
The EU seems committed to maybe even doubling down on economic pressure through sanctions. They see it as vital to make Russia stop.
Right. Sustained pressure is their watchword.
Whereas the US, under President Trump, seems to be leaning towards a faster resolution, even if that means easing pressure on Moscow and causing some serious friction with European allies over trade in the process.
That really captures the core tension, I think. A basic difference in strategic priorities, maybe even in what they see as the best possible outcome. The EU is focused on accountability, supporting Ukraine's fight. The US seems more focused on immediate de-escalation, maybe through a deal, even if it involves tough compromises and shakes up old economic ties.
And these diverging paths, they clearly challenge that idea of Western unity, G7 unity, just when you'd think it's most needed. For Ukraine, stuck in the middle, the uncertainty about future support must be just immense.
It really must be. And this raises a really big question, I think, for you listening. As we see these global power shifts, these national interests being reevaluated, how does that change long-standing alliances?
Yeah.
And what are the long-term effects of these very different approaches? The EU's steady pressure versus the US's more transactional, deal-focused style. What does it mean for global stability, for how we deal with complex conflicts in the future? Definitely something to think about as these events continue to unfold.